Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and today we're going to talk about some of the effects of industrialization, specifically the rise of bourgeois society and reform. So let's dive in. Here's our basic objectives for today. And now we'll talk about some of the effects of growing industrialization and the transformation of a variety of different European economies. So let's dive in. We're going to start with a discussion of this new group emerging called the middle class. The middle class is a group that's somewhat nebulous and difficult to define. But the basic definition, obviously, is they're not in the incredibly wealthy landed aristocracy that we've seen throughout most of human history. They're not peasants or poor laborers. They're this group of people who have somewhat professional jobs. They're going to work outside the home. They're going to have the ability to afford some creature comforts. And their lives, at least the lives outside of work, are going to be divorced from actually producing things. So they're going to go to a job, work it for a period of time, come home, and then have some extra time and money to enjoy those to enjoy the fruits of their labor. This middle class is going to become the driving force in a number of these industrial societies, pushing for greater changes, greater reform. We're going to see changes in tastes and preferences, and the creation of sort of mass entertainment venues and things like that in order to cater to the interests of this new middle class. We're going to see, with the rise of the middle class, a rise in leisure activities, new inventions like bicycles, sporting events, and public sort of sporting venues are going to become more popular. We're going to see games like pool and billiards and fencing and things like that become more popular. Spectacle sports like boxing and horse racing are going to grow in popularity. Obviously, a lot of these had been around for a long time for the wealthy, but now that we've got a whole new group of people that we're looking to entertain, we're going to see a rise in all of these activities, and we're going to see the rise of things like amusement parks, that have no real goal except to allow people to escape sort of the day-to-day lives and go out and ride a fake horse around in a circle for a while. Sounds super fun. We're also going to see the rise of new artistic forms like Romanticism. Romanticism is to some degree a rejection of the Enlightenment and the rationality of the French Revolution, which focused on pure human reason. Romanticism is instead going to embrace human emotion and go the other direction. Sometimes this is connected with religious movements, and we are going to see a second Great Awakening sweeping across Europe as Europe re-embraces Christianity and sort of re-Christianizes after the radical de-Christianization of the French Revolution. But we're also going to see Romanticism just trying to stir emotions in people, featuring landscapes and nationalistic scenes and things like that to try to, again, evoke emotion out of people. We're going to see this through art, through music, through a variety of other sort of mediums. You can clearly see some nationalistic art forms here. Here's Napoleon visits the plague victims, sort of hearkening back to the glory days of the French Empire. Here's along the Oxbow Pass. This is American work highlighting the natural landscape of the United States. And then we see some other nationalistic works, again, focusing on sort of scenes that are iconic in different societies and different geographic locations. And so all of this is, again, trying to appeal to this new industrial class and to evoke, again, emotional responses from them. Romantic composers like Chopin and Beethoven are also going to compose works that harken back to sort of emotional nationalistic appeals in order to try to, again, stir up the emotions in their audiences and try to get an emotional as opposed to a rational response. And so all of these are partial effects of industrialization as we see sort of a growing audience for these types of works. Literature is also going to focus on this. You get the romantics like Poe and Hawthorne and Melville writing about things like these, writing about human emotions and the fight between a man and a whale and stuff like that. We're also going to see works like Frankenstein talking about the human condition, what it is to be human, and what our responsibilities are, as a part of that whole deal in human relationships. And so all of these, again, focus on sort of these romantic notions and attempt to appeal to human emotion as opposed to human reason. We see some of these romantic poems. You can clearly see the themes here. So pause, take a moment and answer the questions, and we'll move on. As part of this, we're also going to see reform movements. As we mentioned previously, religiosity comes back in the aftermath of the French Revolution through what's called the Second Great Awakening. Different preachers embrace a more radical preaching style, and we get a rise of what's called millennialism, basically the belief that the French Revolution brought so much lasting change that clearly we must be in the end of days here. And if you've read your traditional texts, at the end of days in Revelation, Jesus is going to come back. And so it should be our job as devout Christians to attempt to prepare the world for Jesus' arrival and his eventual ruling of his 1,000-year kingdom. And wouldn't Jesus be super happy if, when he came back to establish his 1,000-year kingdom, if we'd already been pushing reform movements to try to do some of the work for him? So Jesus doesn't have to make the world a perfect utopia because we've already started moving in that direction. And then maybe he'll let us live with him in his 1,000-year kingdom as opposed to condemning us to hell forever. So we're going to see a whole bunch of reform movements coming out of this. Robert Fourier is a French philosopher, Charles Fourier is a French philosopher who attempted to create an ideal society with his sort of planned communities, his phalansteries here. And so it would be this massive planned community where everyone has their own role and shares everything equally. And he believed that if everyone embraced his philosophy, eventually the seas would turn to lemonade and we'd live in a perfect, wonderful utopia. Here's some Fourier. Take a moment and read about his phalanx and answer the questions associated with this. The Scottish industrialist Robert Owen also had these planned communities, although they were a little bit more practical. Owen's factory towns attempted to establish an entire equal industrial community within a single complex, and then he would use his wealth to do these things. So take a moment and pause, read the various pieces here, and answer the appropriate questions, and then we'll move on. Owen, of course, using his wealth to try to make the world a better place is sort of socialism, although it's a very sort of industrial-based socialism. And none of Owen's planned communities worked out because in the end, incentives are really important, and not having strong incentives made it really difficult to force people to do the labor. We're also going to see political reform as more and more people push back on this political question here. We've talked about this previously when we talked about the American Revolution and the English Revolution and the American Revolution and the French Revolution. But the basic question is, who should have the power to vote in a society? Should everyone have the power to express their opinions equally? Should you require some sort of property requirement to make sure that you have a stake in society? As you hopefully remember, both the British and the American Revolution required some form of property requirement for voting. But we start seeing, and you can see here this argument here, these Putney debates. But the French Revolution is going to eliminate all property requirements for voting. And for a lot of people who are worried about this whole these poor people voting thing, the French Revolution provides kind of a cautionary tale as far as what can happen if you allow too much democracy. But the Chartists are still pushing for political reform in England. You get similar movements in the United States where people are pushing to eliminate property requirements and moving towards universal white male suffrage. And so take a moment and pause and read these two accounts and figure out what they are arguing here. And so a lot of this is one of the first examples that we see. I mean, we saw this a little bit in Latin America and in Mexico, but the idea that like a little bit of reform is pretty important because if you don't give the people something, it's going to create more groups who are not invested in the status quo and is going to lead to larger revolutions later. So this push for broad sort of gradual reform is almost a shield against later revolution because you're peeling off groups who might be sympathetic to a revolution by providing them with some of the things that they want. In this case, the right to vote. And so the Chartist movement is going to gain some power, and you're going to start seeing a bunch of gradual political reforms in England, providing more groups of people with the right to vote, making Parliament more representative by getting rid of rotten boroughs that really represent no one, and trying to limit the power of wealthy people in government. Of course, the group that is left out of these discussions for the most part is women. There are a bunch of women's suffrage movements at this point, but we're still a solid almost century from women getting the right to vote in most places. And so women are going to be left out of most of these discussions. We're also going to see some economic reform. As the world becomes more interconnected, it becomes more vulnerable to random shocks, corruption, things like that. We have some stock market schemes, like like a British man named Lord Cochrane, who had this scheme that he spread this secret rumor, or he brought in a supposed French ambassador to spread the rumor that Napoleon had died in the midst of the Napoleonic Wars. This then led to a massive increase in the value of government bonds in England, which Lord Cochrane had a bunch of. He then sold for a huge profit. And then by the time it discovered that it was a hoax, the prices had crashed. But Lord Cochrane is going to walk away with millions of extra pounds in dollars from selling these government bonds. So this clearly demonstrates the power that individuals can have, and the idea that maybe the government should have some role over regulating the economy to prevent scandals like this from happening in the future. My favorite economic scandal is the Poyet scheme, where a Scotsman named Gregor MacGregor comes up with this plan to send settlers to this imaginary colony of Poyet, and is going to steal crazy amounts of money and then drop them off somewhere in modern-day Honduras, where they're going to die of yellow fever. He then sells bonds, to help support this whole thing, and it creates a massive scandal, leads to a bunch of people dying of bloodborne illnesses spread by mosquitoes in Honduras along what's called the Mosquito Coast. And eventually, Gregor MacGregor is going to get arrested and charged with all of this stuff. But what this demonstrates is that, again, we need more economic reforms to sort of stop these schemes from happening. This leads to the increased power of central banks. The Bank of England had been established back in the 1600s, but the Bank Charter Act of 1844 gave the directors of the Bank of England more power to control sort of credit and lending within England and to prop up British banks in case of runs on banks or bank failures. This use of central banking is going to allow the English government to regulate the English economy, to provide easy credit, and to provide for substantial economic and industrial expansion. The United States is briefly going to have a bank as well before it's destroyed by a president named Andrew Jackson. And so, England is going to have a relatively sort of moderately stable economic path. The United States is going to face massive banking crises, repeated depressions, and a lack of economic stability. And so in the end, having a bank allows a central government to control more of their economy and to sort of prevent crazy speculative schemes from taking over and destroying things. As we move into the 1940s, we have some significant problems in many of these industrial societies, specifically with weather and monocropping. So take a moment and pause and read about the economy of Ireland. Once you've answered the questions, you obviously significant reliance on potatoes lead to the massive potato blight, which is going to lead to huge amounts of starvation and unrest in Europe, and is going to lead to calls for greater government aid organizations to try to provide help for starving people, both within the United Kingdom and in other places. And so England is going to mostly ignore the Irish potato famine, leading to millions of deaths. And this more or less becomes a model for how not to deal with these economic crises. And more people are going to argue that a government should take a larger role in regulating the economy in order to prevent massive famines from killing millions of people. And so that's where we're going to leave today, with the Hungry 40s leading to political unrest and leading to calls in a lot of places to change the government, to make a more vigorous, responsive government to deal with the problems of these newly complex industrial societies. Thank you for listening.